If I was a betting man in 1917, without the obvious powers of hindsight, I would have almost certainly put my money on the Whites eventually winning the Civil War in some capacity. They had the legitimacy of centuries of rule. They have the experienced generals and the armies. And perhaps most importantly, basically the entire world would far rather see the Whites come to power rather than the new, radical, communist ideology. But as the war progressed, advantages would shift towards the Bolsheviks. They would consolidate the industrial and population centers of Russia itself, relegating the Whites to dispersed, unconnected, often minority-dominated territories on the outskirts of the empire. Especially Bolshevik control over the industry put a timer on the conflict, as each passing year would increase the advantage that they hold. Especially as after the war in Europe concluded, it became clear that the former Entente wasn't prepared to intervene in Russia with anything but minor operations. Another advantage, the Bolshevik movement would fight this war as a roughly unified ideological bloc. The White armies, meanwhile, were a collection of absolutely incompatible ideologies. Were they fighting for an absolute monarchy, for a democratic republic, or were they trying to create an independent Cossack republic? The answer to all of those? Yes they were. This obviously greatly hinders their ability to coordinate, cooperate, and convince the rest of the world to keep sending them aid, and no worries, we got this. Now that is not to say that the war was unwinnable, and together with my local Russia expert Serov, a path to White victory was forged. One of the main assets of the Whites was the Czechoslovak Legion. During World War II, considering the Russians were at war with the Austrians, many Czechs and Slovaks held sympathy for the Entente, hoping for the creation of a Czechoslovak state after the conflict. As such, a group of Czechoslovak volunteers would start to fight for the Russian Empire. This became awkward when the Bolsheviks signed a peace treaty with the Germans. Now, there was no longer any point for them to remain in Russia, but most of the routes out of the nation were cut off by the Germans. Thus, a plan was forged to move all the way across Russia and leave the nation via the Vladivostok port in the Far East. Along the way, Trotsky would demand the demilitarization of the Legion, in response to which they took control over the Trans-Siberian Railway, thereby solidifying the Far East as the best fallout base for the White armies. Beyond that, much of the unity on the Bolshevik side came from one man, Vladimir Lenin. In August of 1918, there was an assassination attempt on his life, which left him seriously injured. It wouldn't be unthinkable that the assassin might just succeed in this attempt, taking out the heart of the Bolshevik Revolution. This happened in the very first year of the Civil War, and while not instantly ending the revolution, it could greatly demoralize and destabilize it, lacking the clear and strong leadership necessary to keep egoists like Stalin in check. Panic among the upper ranks of the revolution could occur. Bukharin was the supposed successor to Lenin at this time, a man who was arguing in favor of renewing a war with the Germans, something which undoubtedly would have been disastrous for the Bolsheviks in the short term. This attempted assassination also wasn't an isolated incident. It was a part of a larger social-revolutionary uprising against the Bolsheviks, who were upset at Lenin's dealings with the Germans, as well as his cancellation of the Constituent Assembly election. This social revolutionary activity could further destabilize the Bolsheviks, while they were explicitly planning to restart a conflict with the Germans, which again, if they are successful in doing this, would likely be a disaster for the revolution, as Germany very much had plans at the ready to march on St. Petersburg or Moscow if it was deemed necessary. This would come with horrible timing on the southern front, as a battle was going to be waged over Tsaritsyn, now known as Volgograd, the city later known as Stalingrad. The White armies were attempting to capture the city, as it was key to not just securing the northern Caucasus region, but also in controlling the Volga River, a big artery for the Russian nation, leading all the way to Moscow. Present in Tsaritsyn was none other than Joseph Stalin. Despite not having any official authority to do so, he would try to take control over the defense of the city, leading to a conflict between him and Trotsky over leadership. Without a guiding hand in Moscow to ease this dispute, it could easily escalate yet further, dividing the movement. Even worse, if this translates to a military victory by the Whites, it could see Stalin trapped, killed, or captured in the city, making it not just a military disaster for the Bolsheviks, it also removes yet another high-ranking official. The destabilizing of the Bolsheviks and this victory at Tsaritsyn come right before a double offensive aimed at Moscow and St. Petersburg in 1919. Essentially, even in our timeline, these two pushes represent the one moment where the Whites almost won, as the fall of the twin capitals would lose the industrial advantage of the Bolsheviks as well as much of their administrative core. It could realistically be the start of the collapse of the Reds altogether. The armies of the southern commander, Denikin, got to about 300 kilometers from Moscow, though they were running thin on their supply routes. It is not hard to imagine that with the fundamental weakening of the Reds, with a little bit of luck and perhaps French aid through Greece and Ukraine arriving a month earlier than historically, this march on Moscow could succeed, and the Bolshevik movement might start to crumble. The war would still take a while to conclude, but in practice, it'd be basically over, as the Whites consolidate themselves as the rulers of Russia again. But what might happen next? Well, many imagine an automatic, glorious conclusion for Russia, as the horrors of Bolshevism have been prevented and an America-like democratic republican system will lead Russia to greatness. Now, this is obviously a very attractive future to look at, but it is also a vision which, in my opinion, is mostly blinded by an understandable ideological hatred towards Stalin and communism. While I by no means endorse those ideologies, I do think that this vision of Russia ignores some very serious short-term issues for the Whites. So, let's explore those issues. First, while the Reds may be defeated, Russia would not be unified. The former Entente are still present in the nation, and will make sure to exploit their influence on the new regime, mainly aimed at ensuring that they pay back their debts. Beyond that, we have the Alash Orda, a group in Kazakhstan allied with the Whites, hoping to leverage support for independence, or at least autonomy. Meanwhile, control over the south of Central Asia has been lost to Basmachi fundamentalists. The Caucasus is still independent, while Bolshevik guerrilla warfare in Russia's core areas would continue for years, while fleeing Bolsheviks might even join up with Makhno's anarchist Peasant Republic in Ukraine, or perhaps even the Poles, while independence wars in Ukraine restart. The Poles specifically didn't really care which color of Russia they fought. They were fighting against the concept of Russia in general, and a white victory really doesn't change their goals in any way. Actually, it's quite the contrary. Either side winning this early only cements Poland's need to fight. Finally, there's also the minor matter of Finland. Does Russia accept its loss there, or does a Finland conflict restart over disagreements over their future status? It should be clear that despite the main civil war being over, Russia is far from secure. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. Now, of course, a lot of this was also the case after the Bolshevik victory. Don't get me wrong. But there is reason to believe that it would be worse for the Whites. In our timeline, most of the fighting in the Civil War was very much fought away from the core into the periphery. In this timeline, the fighting has been aimed at Russia's biggest cities, thereby causing far more damage to Russia's industry. For context, these major cities already lost between 40 and 60% of the population in our timeline. We can expect this drain to be even more significant here, leaving near ghost cities. This already means an initially weaker Russia, but it goes further. The Bolsheviks had already created plans in case they lost. Imagine mass sabotage of the heartland of the empire, destruction of infrastructure, factories and property, the execution of figures potentially useful to the new regime, and even the mass printing of counterfeit currency to crash the Russian economy. We can also expect a great deal of guerrilla movements around Russia's big cities, continuing for quite a while. But even amongst the Russian periphery, many peasants might again radicalize against the new government, making things even harder. While the Bolsheviks had started the Red Terror, that doesn't mean that the general population is necessarily enthusiastic about the return of the Whites. Remember that, despite our modern opinion of the Reds, there is a reason they won in our timeline. In the short term, they had implemented reforms, improving conditions for farmers by redistributing farmlands. And at least on paper, they were empowering the workers and the peasants. Fears of such privileges being taken away would further weaken the new government. Economically speaking, Russia is also a mess. Already in 1916, the Russian Empire had a debt-to-GDP ratio of about 200%, which would have become even worse with the loss of many Western territories and the destruction of a civil war. The West would initially be sympathetic to the new regime, and they wouldn't immediately demand back the full amount, but eventually, the West would expect their money back. This wasn't the case in our timeline, since the Bolsheviks were already hated by all the Entente powers, and they just defaulted on their debt completely, greatly facilitating their economic progress. This alternate Russia would start off with a quite immense economic burden. Then there is the issue of the new government. Do they become a democracy? If so, do they become a republic? Or do they seek a new monarch to install? If yes, do they continue an absolutist Tsarist regime, or is a constitutional monarchy more likely? One of the more likely options is for some general to just assume absolute power into a dictatorship. All of these options are moderately possible, but for the sake of this video, we will explore the possibility of a democracy, as it is the only option moderately acceptable to most, as well as the likely more plausible dictatorial regime that might roll out of the conflict. Now, if we assume an actually moderately fair democracy, with the doubtless exception of the Bolsheviks, which would be banned, the Socialist Revolutionary Party seems most likely to be elected as the largest party, much like they were in our timeline. And ironically enough, this party would still be quite leftist. Obviously not to the extent of the communists, but still very socialist. This shouldn't be too much of a surprise, as the socialists just had the most to promise to the majority peasant population of Russia. But despite this democratic result, the more conservative elements fighting for the White armies, even if they don't immediately seize the government, wouldn't just disappear, and they would continue to have outsized influence on politics, and especially within the military, where ideas of nobility, tsars, and empire continued to fester. Now, the other option is for some dictator or another to seize power in the nation. Who exactly this is too difficult to tell. As such, we will focus on the general themes and motives that might mark a dictatorial Russia. They would certainly harken back to the times of the Tsar, possibly either legitimizing their rule through some form of eternal regency, either without actual intent to invite an heir, or by inviting some royal or another, but keeping him on a tight leash, with the actual power continuing to reside primarily with the military. Denikin, Kornilov, and Kolchak are all candidates for a potential military dictator of Russia, and whoever comes out on top, a purge or even a minor resumed civil war to eliminate the opposition is quite possible. It is even possible that this dictator installs a managed democracy to ease the population a little bit, where a weak and ineffective parliament does exist, but one that is unable to effectively contain the power of the military, dictator, or Tsar. Another big possibility is that the Whites, perhaps under Western pressure, do actually attempt or pretend to install a democracy, but upon seeing the Social Revolutionary Party win, the military stages a coup anyway and outlaws most left-wing and liberal parties. Compared to the previously mentioned democratic option, which likely will also be unstable, I think this Russia would have a far more difficult future ahead of it. But regardless of the government that ends up in power, the short-term conclusion of the Russian Civil War doesn't change too much. Let's continue on the matter of the ongoing independence wars, most notably the coming conflict with Poland. Like mentioned before, Pilsudski, the man in power in the nation, didn't really care that much if the Whites or the Reds came out on top in Russia. To him, and to many others in Eastern Europe, Russia was the threat in itself, regardless of ideology. To this end, he was a proponent of the Prometheus concept, which in theory would see Poland take position as the main power in Eastern Europe, graciously helping the other nationalities gaining their independence, and then tying those nations together in alliance with Poland, thereby hopefully preventing a resurgence of Russian power. Of course, in practice the execution was much more in service of a grand revived Poland. Once the White armies managed to break the Bolsheviks in the east, expect the Poles to push in significantly, while the Ukrainians likewise intensify their own independence struggle, very much solidifying the Polish-Ukrainian positions in the west before the Bolsheviks truly collapse. When compared to the Reds of our timeline, the Whites will initially have fewer soldiers, as they have yet to set up the administration and mobilization in the most populous and industrial areas of Russia. For reference, during the entire Civil War, the Bolsheviks fielded about 6 times the soldiers, and it will take a while before the Whites can field remotely similar numbers. The Whites also had a disproportionate numbers of officers and too few actual soldiers, with many of the infantry having sided with the Reds. Yet worse, Ukraine in our timeline was broadly split between factions seeking independence and factions which believed Bolshevik promises of autonomy, and the general, radical promises they made to the peasantry. Neither of these parties are likely to now align with the Red armies, especially not the dictatorial kind, as most of the White army generals focused heavily on the indivisibility of Russia and their desire for a return to 1914 borders. Even the democratic variety of White Russia is likely far less popular in Eastern Europe. Compared to the Bolsheviks, the White armies are just seen as far more of a continuation of the Tsardom. Therefore, they are less likely to find allies amongst those who fear a return to Russian hegemony. This makes it significantly more likely that, compared to our timeline, the Poles in some form achieve a greater victory, potentially even liberating some form of Ukrainian Republic, of course under Polish influence, roughly up to the Dnipro, if not just achieving a full victory. Either way, any such losses represent yet more beatings to Russia's population, agriculture, resources, industry, and future strategic depth. By this point, I want to pull your attention to the Turkish War of Independence. The Bolsheviks played a big role in assisting the Turkish Republicans by supplying them with weapons on the one hand and assisting in the defeat of the Armenians on the other, allowing the Turks to focus on their other fronts. It is quite possible that this changes in this alternate timeline, as the Whites could very well formulate a totally different policy on the region. In a worst case for Turkey, the Whites might get Armenia and even Georgia to integrate or ally with them, underpinning the defense of their Orthodox brethren. This could greatly complicate the military situation for Turkey, potentially leading to a moderate defeat against the Entente. Alternatively, Turkey might decide to give up on Armenia, unwilling to start a conflict with Russia over it, while Russia too would prefer to focus on Poland. In this case, the Turks would likely mostly still win their war of independence, as Italy, France, and especially Britain just didn't really care enough to invest in it, and the Greeks just couldn't do it alone. In this case, at worst, Greece might keep Western Thrace, with Turkey regaining their capital, as the border becomes demilitarized. But even then, I think it's more likely that we just reach the same western borders as in our timeline. A final potential curveball might be the Russians trying to reassert control over Constantinople, as the Entente had promised this to them during the war. The city had a huge historical and political value for Russia. Of course, Such an attempt would almost certainly be prevented by Britain, which is unlikely to give in to such a weakened Russia. Something like this could be the western border of post-war Russia. Compared to our timeline, they're weaker against the Poles, but stronger in the south, though they have opened up options for a future conflict with Turkey, adding them to the large list of nations that Russia has conflicts with. On the larger scale, some form of autonomy agreement could be made with the Alash Orda, as the rest of Central Asia would be reconquered without too much issue. Over in the east, Mongolia would still be taken over by Baron von Ungern-Sternberg, and through that would remain in Russia's orbit. Japan might try a minor power play in the Far East, but Western pressure will get them to back off, as Russia returns to be a major player in the region. Overall, the Russia that has come rolling out of the previous decades is significantly weaker, but it does have a few advantages. Best case, it's a democracy, potentially bolstering its stability and their quality of leadership. It also now actually has decent ties to the rest of the world, which could help on its path to recovery. While initial economic growth might just be slightly lower than that of the Bolsheviks, considering the circumstances, an air of optimism could still reign over the new state. Its economic revival extremely impressive for the horrific experiences the nation saw in the past few decades. But sadly, I don't think that this would last for too long. The Soviets, not fully by choice, weren't all too connected to the global economy. This had a lot of downsides, especially in the creation of a long-term competitive economy. But in the short term, it would prove to be a blessing. Why? Because in 1929, the American economy would crash, the effects of which would ripple out worldwide. The Soviets were partially shielded from this, not feeling that much pain, and instead greatly propagandizing the event, showing it as a failing of global capitalism and a triumph for socialism. Sadly, the White Russians wouldn't have the same luxury. The Great Depression would end the honeymoon period surrounding the Russian regime. Prior to this, I expect the West to have been lenient with their debt repayment, understanding that Russia is in a tough spot and it is unlikely that they get squeezed too hard. There was even a provision in the Treaty of Versailles, Article 116, which allowed the Entente to direct some German war reparations to the Russians, which could slightly alleviate their situation. It should be noted, however, that this was mostly a ploy by the Entente powers to ensure the Russians could pay back their own loan, starting a rather complicated economic situation for the post-war states, likely further complicated by America doing the same to Russia as they did to Germany historically, providing cheap investments to bolster their economy, ensuring they can repay the French and the British, so they in turn can repay America. Now, for as long as this flow of money continues to work, it is fantastic for all sides, facilitating a minor economic miracle in Russia. But once any of these money streams are threatened, which we know they will be in the upcoming Great Depression, Russia could be hit even harder than Germany was in our timeline. You know the story. Depression hits, American investments slow down, as they even demand back some money. Germany and Russia struggle with their finances, causing the entire loop to just shut down, and the American economic crisis has just gone global. And the Russian situation gets even worse than just additional ties to the rest of the world. Their economy, while growing, might still be a lot more agriculturally focused than that of the Soviets, and very possibly with less modern techniques too. Soviet collectivization was horrifying, and I do not want to whitewash their actions, but it was combined with a state-sponsored push for the modernization of the agricultural sector, something a free market White Russia would struggle to accomplish in the short term. Besides, the Soviet government controlled the profits from agricultural sales, which likewise would be ruthlessly reinvested in further industrialization. This likewise wouldn't happen in a democratic or reactionary Russia. That is not to say that mechanization of agriculture and industrialization don't occur at all, but pretty much by design, it happens on a lesser scale and more gradually. Russia, as it stands, is just significantly more vulnerable to the Great Depression. If we then follow the idea of a truly democratic Russia, we can expect political upheavals in the untested political system. For many Russians, not unlike what happened in Germany, the forces opposed to the status quo would rise, as the very real progress the Russian people were making over the past decade is wiped away in a year. While there would still be plenty to celebrate the new regime for, this would be overshadowed by new economic despair, giving renewed strength to whatever Bolsheviks were still active, as fears of a second civil war could take hold. This turns our attention to the military, the figures that won the civil war, but then stood aside for democracy to take over. This would be the time for them to rise again, having maintained significant influence over the military of the new state. With the nation in seeming crisis and the government struggling, fears of a Bolshevik revival rising, we might see them act, and in some form seize the government, dismantling democracy a decade after the Civil War anyways. Once more, they might push for imperial restoration, but would definitely push for some form of aristocracy, underpinning the need for Russia to reassert itself on the world stage. Such a decline would, aside from a side note I will cover later, partially merge the dictatorial and democratic Russia timelines. Essentially, in this scenario, we could see Russia become a mix between Germany, Japan and Italy before the rise of their ultranationalists. A feeble democracy is undermined by an economic crisis, which gives rise to the reactionary military to improve their position, seeking military expansion, while fears of the rising socialists and civil war leads to the establishment empowering these ultranationalists. Now don't get me wrong, this is not absolutely guaranteed. I am sure there are scenarios where democracy pulls through. But considering the massive uphill battle which the Russian state has to fight, I would personally put my money on the collapse of Russian democracy in most scenarios. For the sake of completion, despite me thinking it unlikely, we will also continue to discuss a scenario where some form of democracy weathers the storm, though through a lot of hardships. Now, what if the military was already in power at the time of the Great Depression? Well then, things get more complicated, as it now depends on the specific regime and how well it can maintain control. The advantage it has over democracy is that it can deal with revolts far more brutally. The disadvantage it has is that there is nobody to blame for the crisis except for them. The revival of the Bolsheviks would be even stronger, with Lenin and his comrades being remembered as heroes, as the potential saviors of Russia, which were unjustly thrown aside by the nefarious intervention of the West. I would argue that in such scenarios, there is even a significant chance of some form of second Russian civil war, potentially with not just the Bolsheviks, but also more liberal revolutionaries rising up against the government. Who might succeed here is difficult to say, so we will be following in relative detail a timeline where a feeble democracy somehow survives or is born out of a revolution after the Great Depression, as well as a timeline where a dictatorship is either created after the Great Depression or immediately after the Civil War. We will also explore the scenario about a second civil war somewhere in the 30s. Before we can though, we need to do something quite difficult. Explore the potential effects which the existence of the Bolsheviks had on the world. Most importantly, on Europe. The rise of the ultranationalists in Germany, for example, cannot easily be separated from the existence of the Soviet Union. The Italian pseudo-civil war after World War I might also be changed, lessening the chance of Mussolini rising to power in the nation. Don't get me wrong, I am not saying that these things are definitely avoided. Even without the Bolsheviks, there are still very real reasons for these things to happen. Italy, by virtue of their economic situation, is going to inch close to a revolution as well. But the Biennio Rosso, where 500,000 workers in Italy went on strike, occupying 600 factories and attempting socialist experiments, was called in direct solidarity with the Russian Civil War. While I don't doubt a reactionary victory in Italy, the specific path Mussolini took to power is undoubtedly altered. This could then ripple onto Germany, as the German dictator of our timeline was very inspired by the events happening in Italy, and his misplaced attempt to replicate it from Munich, despite it failing heavily, did help to elevate his popularity and notoriety across Germany, assisting his later takeover a decade later. Basically, it is very possible that we have butterflied away the specific development of ultranationalism in Germany. Note, what I mean by this is that it has the potential to fundamentally change the direction and specifics of German ultranationalism, meaning that even if, at some point, ultranationalism takes over Germany, it might have completely different characteristics. This doesn't even have to come at the hands of a different person, like the Strassers, leading the movement instead. Even the dictator of our timeline was heavily affected by the Bolshevik Revolution. Of course, the concept of Lebensraum was already and would still be a loose goal. But if we read the works of the dictator, we see that his hatred of Russia was significantly intensified by the Bolsheviks being in power. Simultaneously, White Russian emigres to Germany and Europe greatly shaped ultranationalism on the continent, hearing their accounts on the situation in their motherland. His views on Russia on the whole might not be fundamentally altered, yet the intensity of his intention to march east could have been. Finally, there might even be an increased chance for a democratic Germany to weather the storm. The socialist SPD and communist KPD had split as a result of the Great War, but some argue that this split was made permanent by Bolshevik success in the Civil War, not in small part due to Stalin portraying social democracy as just as bad as ultranationalism, a line which the German communists followed, preventing reconciliation between the communists and social democrats. Now, it is far from guaranteed, but there is a chance that a more unified socialist bloc does better in the later German elections, potentially allowing the left to put up a better defense against rising ultranationalism. Again, either defending democracy or allowing some less extreme clique of German nobles and/or military figures to take charge of the nation instead, potentially with a far more pro-Russian attitude, seeing common ground against the perceived slights from the former Western Entente. Now for me, these factors obviously present huge difficulties to the continuation of this scenario. So many butterflies have just been introduced beyond just the effects on Russia. Personally, I would put my money on some form of right-wing dominated government seeking power in Germany in the 1930s. Near every German despised Versailles and faced difficulties due to the Great Depression. Yet even if the same ultranationalists of our timeline take over, their entire way of acting on the world stage could have been altered, more focused on the destruction of the far more hated Poland than the Soviets in Russia. Alternatively, the German ultranationalists might just fail to take power. They were very much the exception to the norm of reactionism in Germany. Some form of military clique of former Kaiser loyalists could just as well rise instead, leading to a still aggressive, but possibly more moderate foreign policy. As you might imagine, all of these questions way complicate how specific I can be for the rest of this video. We must finally reckon then with the effects on Asia, where the lack of the Soviet Union is likewise very significant. Starting as early as the days of Lenin, the Soviet Union concerned itself greatly with the Chinese Civil War. For example, the Whampoa Military Academy was primarily funded by Soviet aid. This academy would eventually go on to train most of the Chinese commanders of the time period, while Generalissimo and dictator Chiang Kai-shek was the superintendent. As the Chinese lacked the military experience to staff the academy themselves, they relied greatly on veterans from the Russian Civil War. Simultaneously, the Soviets forced the nationalists to align with the communists, with figures like Zhou Enlai also serving at this same military academy. Both of these influences would now be gone, and it should be noted that by this point the Kuomintang was rather weak. While none of the other great powers wanted to support them, as the nationalists were rather openly anti-imperialist. We must therefore consider the attitude that a white Russia might take on the situation, where I do think it matters if we are dealing with a dictatorial or democratic white Russia. Either way though, the Russians will never see any value in allying with the by this point rather weak communists, already removing the early United Front. Beyond that, much like how the Western powers wouldn't support the anti-imperialist nationalists, I cannot see the dictatorial Russia doing so either. If anything, they might take the Japan approach, continuing the Tsarist policy of encroaching into China, perhaps seeking their own clique of warlords to support against growing Japanese influence over the nation. In the case of a democratic Russia, I could see them more enthusiastically align with the nationalists. The ideals of a social democratic Russia and Sun Yat-sen being quite aligned. Of course, though, the Chinese Civil War was a hot mess. These are just two rough options, and rather than explore one clear timeline for Asia, we're going to quickly dip through a number of possibilities. To start, I don't think that we have fundamentally changed Japan itself. Their path towards militarism had started decades earlier and wasn't as reliant on the Soviets as German ultranationalism might have been. The specifics of their priority might be impacted, of course, but don't expect a wholesome democratic Japan in this timeline. Yet what is important is that, assuming a weakened nationalist army, Japan might just be more successful in containing them to southern China, potentially entrenching the pro-Japanese Kangxian clique in the north, likely increasing divisions in China, and through these divisions, increasing Japanese influence. Alternatively, the nationalists might still see successes, perhaps eventually still becoming the dominant government in China. Yet, the lack of a Soviet-sponsored on and off partnership with the communists would already have changed China, potentially allowing for the nationalists to consolidate more power and be in a stronger position. But more importantly, this would almost certainly butterfly away the Xiang incident, where in 1936 the communists captured Chiang Kai-shek, dictator of the nationalists, forcing him to create the Chinese United Front with the communists against Japan. This was a very significant event, as before this point, Chiang had pursued a policy of appeasement. Without the communists shaking this up, it is not unthinkable that the Chinese continue to pursue this careful appeasement policy for longer, which can swiftly become significant, as the war being delayed by even 2 years will completely change the Japanese and Chinese calculations for war, as Europe could be set ablaze. Of course, that is all assuming a rather passive Russia. Especially in the case of a dictatorial regime, I could easily see the threat of a new Russo-Japanese war breaking out somewhere in the 1920s or 30s. Both sides were very interested in controlling Manchuria, and Japan had shown very clear imperial ambitions on the Russian Far East during the Civil War. Such tensions between Tokyo and Moscow likewise complicate German ambitions regarding Asia, who were already balancing China and Japan in our timeline, but now have to contend with Russian influence too. There is a decent chance that a Berlin-Tokyo axis is never created, assuming the Germans are interested in a full alliance with the right Russia. A democratic Russia is likely more passive than a dictatorial one would be, more focused on fostering the nationalist as an allied regime, compared to the divide and conquer policy that Russia might otherwise engage in. Finally, in either case, if Russia is seriously concerned with the fate of China, we might likewise see the Sino-Japanese War of our timeline prevented or pushed to a later date, as the risk of a full war with China and Russia might just be too great for Japan. Again, even a mild delay of roughly 2 years could alter world history significantly. There is also a chance, though I deem it minor, that Japanese expansionism into China is already halted at Manchuria due to Russian pressure. But, considering this invasion was launched at the start of the Great Depression, Russia might not want to risk war over it, only ensuring that their railway rights are still respected. We might even imagine scenarios where somewhere in the 20s or 30s, Russia and Japan engage in a full-scale war, with China not even being involved. Depending on the intensity and time frame of such a conflict, this could also greatly complicate Russia's position in Europe, as they wouldn't really be in a position to confront a rising Germany when already involved in or exhausted from a large war in Asia. So that about concludes my broad analysis of the situation in Asia. And as you might imagine, most of the conclusions boil down to the only thing I know, being that I know nothing. This is such a gigantic and far-reaching scenario, it's difficult to get specific. Still, I wanted to leave you all with just a few of the possible scenarios stemming from here. For the sake of having something to anchor the scenario around, assume some form of aggressive Germany relatively close to the one in our timeline. We will also explore the very real chance of a second civil war, as well as how a dictatorial and democratic Russia might fare differently in competition or alliance with a rising Germany. Let's start first with the shortest one. What if Russia exploded into a second civil war in the 30s? Again, this is far from unthinkable. The popularity of the Bolsheviks, or at least of anti-establishment forces, came from somewhere, and these do not disappear just because the civil war ends. I do, however, think that a second civil war scenario is more likely in the timelines where a dictator takes over, as in these cases, the population lacks the outlet for their discontent. Let's say the revolution enters full swing around 1934. How might this change things? Well, we could easily imagine Russia becoming a significantly more important version of the Spanish Civil War. But rather than the conflict taking place in what is, all things considered, an unimportant peripheral state, it is a fight for one of the most crucial nations in the world. For the sake of this scenario, we will assume that the Bolsheviks have at least decent successes at the start of the conflict. After all, if they swiftly get knocked down, we just return to some form of the dictatorship timeline we'll cover after this. On the whole, I don't have that much faith in the Bolsheviks winning this second conflict. While undoubtedly they might again be the more popular faction amongst the Russian population, the world is now not recently out of a great war. And even if the West still maintains practical neutrality, we could imagine the Germans and Italians backing the Whites strongly in this new conflict. And much like in Spain, potentially more so, we might see many foreigners flock to the revolution too. As while the fall of Spain to either side would be regrettable, but in the end, minor, the fate of Russia is far more crucial to everyone on Earth. But arguably, who comes out on top isn't even the most important factor in this new civil war. Rather, the big question is, who manages to take advantage of a weakened Russia? We know that in the previous war, Japan had intentions on the Russian Far East, yet international pressure pushed them out. This is unlikely to happen again here, as Japan at this point had begun to drift against expansionist militarism. I would argue it near guaranteed that after Japan moves into Manchuria before this conflict, they would decide to further push the Russians out of the region, at least occupy northern Sakhalin, and if the conflict drags on, or the Bolsheviks give them an excuse, they might even occupy most of the Far East and the Russian railroads. This would absolutely be condemned by the international community, but paralyzed by the Great Depression and the aftershocks of World War I, they are unlikely to do more than condemning diplomatic no. In cases of a relatively mild civil war, Japan might just seize the Manchurian Rail and northern Sakhalin, but in heavy civil wars, they might gain as much influence as Mongolia, and through the control over the Eastern Railway, practically destroy Russian power projection into the east. In Central Asia, we might likewise see moves towards independence. The Caucasus, especially if independent but allied to Russia, could again break with Moscow, as would the Muslim areas. Armenia might be the most loyal to Russia, fearful of Turkish retribution, but in practice, Russia would have little to offer them in way of protection. And depending on if Turkey deems it worth their while, and whether or not a population transfer has taken place, We might even see a Turkish military intervention into the region. Most important though is the Western Front. Polish Marshal and dictator Pilsudski, as mentioned half an hour ago in this video, hated Russia, regardless of the powers that be within them. Especially if we assume the Poles have greater success in the last civil war, we can easily imagine them getting involved again, perhaps taking more of Ukraine and Belarus from a crumbling Russia. This might go on to weaken Poland later on, as with Russia no longer a threat, Ukraine is likely to turn even more against the Poles, or in fact, might find themselves starting to shift to sympathize with their Russian brethren in the east after finding the grand promises Poland made were little more than a change of management. Whatever happens there long term though, short term, the point is that Russia is once more greatly weakened, using yet more crucial territories. Of course, something like this would be amongst the worst case scenarios for a second civil war, but all of these things were based on very real goals by real people in these regions. Regardless on who is the victor within Russia itself, Russia would find itself horribly ill-equipped to deal with the threats now posed by the Japanese and whatever regime might now call the shots in Germany, trying to pull itself back together one fight at a time, with their industry and resource production crushed, wholly incapable of fielding a competitive, modern army. For Russia's sake, we must hope that the regime in Germany is towards the more reasonable end of expansionist megalomania, because if Germany launches anything close to Operation Barbarossa, like in our timeline, I would not put my money on Russia lasting more than a year. The fate of the world at that point is in the hands of France, Britain, and America. Their final victory, not impossible, but also far from assured. So, that is one of the major options, which was already pretty bad for the world. Let's make it even worse, as we discuss a timeline where Russia's dictatorship solidifies. If things go wrong, this could be absolutely terrifying. If the Germans were capable of reaching agreement with their ideological arch nemesis, it doesn't seem too far-fetched that an alternate Russo-German pact might be developed too, both sides having clear interests in rewriting the borders of Eastern Europe, while both sides might have grown sour on the Western-led Versailles world order. The depth of this alliance would depend on the German regime's focus to conquer Eastern Europe, or whether they care more about exacting revenge on the West, and if and for how long they might be willing to delay their eventual goal on Russia. In my mind though, considering that Russia is fundamentally weaker and not communist, I think it is very likely that Germany is far more malleable towards a long-term alliance with the Russians than they were in our timeline. Likely even more so if the military takes charge rather than the ultranationalists, sympathizing yet more with Russia's feelings of lost empire and pride. At the same time, Russia's views on such an alliance might also be changed. Stalin wasn't an ideologue, he was a careful opportunist. He was happy about his alliance with Germany, assuming the Germans and the West would be at war for years, thereby allowing him to relatively peacefully expand his own influence while building up his own infrastructure and military. By no means did Stalin ever plan to join the Germans in a crusade against the West, and, much like everyone else in 1939, he had not anticipated a swift German victory over France. His later requests to be added as an Axis power were aimed at expanding Soviet influence further, and there is nothing in these discussions to suggest that he planned to actually strike into Persia and start a conflict with the British. Both sides were very aware of what the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was, a temporary stepping stone to improve their own position for the coming war. This alternate Russia could act very differently, though of course, it is difficult to give clear motivations without knowing exactly who is in power. But again, they are likely led by more militaristic figures, for whom expansion is not a means to an end, it was the goal to be strived after. Restoring Russia's 1914 borders, one and indivisible, was the motivation of most White Army generals. Besides, while there might be some anger towards Germany for World War I, this likely pales in comparison to anger towards the West. Their greed to collect on the debts incurred to fight for their side of World War I would likely be blamed for the economic crash. While if Russia at some point was a democracy that later collapsed, we would see Western values more broadly being discredited, and with it, implicitly the Western powers themselves too. I think it is also likely that, unlike Stalin of our timeline, such a war would see a war with the West as an inevitable short-term goal, solidifying their likelihood to more closely align with the Germans and actually join a war when it comes to it. Of course, all of this is heavy speculating, as global geopolitics are completely upset. So once more, I hope you understand that I will start following a World War II timeline similar to our own, despite the fact that more than likely, significant parts of this will have been altered in this timeline. But with the amount of changes introduced, it is the only way to continue without constantly saying, but I don't know. So somewhere in the 1930s, the Germans start remilitarizing and expanding, while Russia and Germany start cooperating, Germany helping Russia's industry, most notably cooperating to improve oil extraction, and in exchange, Germany gets resources from the Russians. When Germany demands the Sudetenland, nothing will have changed about the West not feeling ready for war, leading to the dismantling of the state, with attention now aimed at Poland, the biggest enemy of both the Germans and the Russians. Before long, Germany declares war, and Russia swiftly joins in, aiming to reassert their hegemony primarily over Ukraine. World War II has begun. It is possible that the West doesn't immediately declare war on Russia, just like they did in our timeline, hoping to keep the war restricted to just Germany. Meanwhile, the Russo-German alliance makes very short work of the Polish state. The borders afterwards, though, would be completely different, with the Germans in some way ending up with far more, though the specific borders I cannot tell you. This increase for Germany is for the simple reason that the Russians will have less leverage over these negotiations, ruling over a less powerful state, less capable of pushing their power. But it is after this that things really start to change, as when Germany pulls their focus to Norway, the Russians start preparing for their own adventures, very possibly by preparing for an invasion of Iran, a long-standing goal of Imperial Russia, which would greatly destabilize British oil supply, while putting pressure on both India and the Middle East. If Russia does launch an operation of this kind, Britain cannot ignore it, and Russia will officially be in the war as well. Regardless, we shouldn't expect Russia to have swift and easy victories here. Iran is very mountainous, and this was an invasion the British would have prepared for, most notably by sending planes to the region, which would immediately attempt to destroy Russian oil refineries. It is a bit unclear how strong Russia's military would be. The great Soviet leaders like Zhukov and Rokossovsky wouldn't be here, as they fought for the Reds during the Civil War. The White armies did have some decent generals, but these would now mostly be old, dead, or stuck in their World War I era ways, with a bloated but untested officer corps beneath them. Compared to post-purge Soviet generals though, there is likely some improvement, but we shouldn't pretend like the generals of the Russian Empire were amazing, and the imperial system for the military would have been continued in White Russia. Expect Russia's military to function similar to that of the French or the Poles at the start of the war. Big and powerful on paper, but completely stuck in the past. This Russia is also likely less invested in heavy industry, lacking the ability to compete in the more modern, mechanized warfare, and likely less able to adapt their militaries during the conflict like Britain, America, and even the Soviet Union did during the war of our timeline. Still, compared to World War I Russia, we can expect them to at least be more prepared in terms of the basics. They will not struggle as much with guns and ammunitions, but they would in terms of airplanes, tanks, and mechanization. I personally think that overall, this alternate Russian army is weaker than the Soviet one, but it starts the conflict better led. Russia's comparative situation might get worse though. Their control over the West could be less secure, having been recently conquered, depending on what the Polish occupation did to Ukrainian opinions about Russia. The Turks could also be more interested in allying with the West, very fearful of the rising Russians, whose renewed ambitions on Constantinople would be well known. In the East too, the Japanese might perform much better in border conflicts against this alternate Russia, potentially considering a land war against the Russians rather than a naval conflict against the West. Even if Japan doesn't directly invade though, this is a front the Russians need to watch for even more so than in our timeline. Finland then represents a threat on the city of St. Petersburg, leading to a hard-fought war like in our timeline, the conflict undoubtedly costing the Russians more than it's actually worth. It is possible though that their better leadership and their simple numerical advantage allows them to clutch out a full victory here, if the Russians care enough to fight for it. It is likewise possible that Finland is less militarized than they were in our timeline, as they don't have the same fears that they had towards the communists. So, Russia joining the war doesn't represent a blazing superpower destroying the British in a year. But arguably, it doesn't have to be. More Allied resources are tied up in Iran, while the Germans could still manage to overrun the French, and the Italians join the conflict too. Pressure on Britain would be mounting, and it is far from guaranteed the nation even continues to struggle, as this war looks significantly more hopeless than that of our timeline, with another front starting in Egypt. Assuming the German leadership doesn't do something really stupid, like going to war with Russia anyways, the focus on the war shifts to the Mediterranean. I could even see something like Turkey joining the Allies and Greece ending up joining the Axis, as Germany tries to open up a third front into the Middle East. If the Axis plays their cards right here, the amount of pressure on Britain might just be too much. And if the Middle East does fully collapse, not only does a British collapse look far more likely, it would also solve Germany's oil deficiency, and importantly, means that Germany is no longer dependent on Russia for the resource, allowing the more radical German governments, if they so choose, to now prepare for a war with Russia, as an uneasy peace might emerge over Europe. In a worst-case scenario, America isn't as directly shocked awake from its isolation, leaving Britain in a very bad situation if Germany does later try to conquer Russia, making a full German victory quite plausible. In a best-case scenario, Britain could intervene once Germany invades Russia with the backing of the Americans, as the definitive battle of Europe unfolds. Of course, we can never count the West out of such conflicts, but considering the fundamental weakness of Russia, this war could be unrivaled in terms of devastation, far worse than the World War II of our timeline ever was. So, that was a rather depressing timeline. To conclude the video on a moderately more positive note, what if the Russian democracy does somehow remain in power in Russia? This could make things very interesting, but a lot would still depend on the Russian attitudes towards the rise of the ultranationalists in Germany. And obviously, it's difficult to predict the specifics of a hypothetical regime 20 years from our starting point. If I had to guess, the Russian state would far favor the West over the Germans. But much like in our timeline, they struggle to convince the West of their power, who possibly even prefer Poland as a partner in the region. This is mostly caused by Russo-Polish tensions, which much like in our own timeline, complicate the actions Russia can take against Germany, as Poland and Ukraine would under no circumstance let Russian soldiers past, out of very rational fears that the Russians simply wouldn't leave afterwards. Assuming it ever comes to something like the Munich conference, the Russians still would be snubbed by the West on account of France and Britain's lacking war readiness. Again, this is just one of many possible options, intentionally one close to our timeline, even if it likely wouldn't be. We will assume that after being snubbed by the West, this might make the Russians grow closer to Germany, with the Russians developing a mild partnership closer to that of our timeline. Not one where Russia seeks out war with the West, but one where Russia simply seeks to benefit from and remain neutral in the war between the West and the Germans to further their own interests in Eastern Europe. As it's important to remember that just because you're a democracy, that doesn't mean you can't seek territorial expansion. And even in a democratic Russia, there would still be many which would seek at least a partial restoration of the former borders of Imperial Russia. Essentially, I could imagine here that the Russians try a strategy similar to, but less intense, than the one that Stalin utilized. But I think it might work out even worse for a democratic Russia. Like in the previous scenario, the Germans take control over far more Polish territory, as Russia still lacks leverage. The points I've made about Russia's military also very much still apply, with old World War I generals dominating the military and a lack of industry to conduct modern warfare with. Much like in our timeline, the hope that the Germans and the West might fight each other for years is dashed by the conquest of France. But unlike in this other timeline, where even ultranationalist Germany might delay a war with Russia due to their aid against Britain, we might see a Germany which, after realizing that Britain is not giving up, turns around to start preparing for and then launching Operation Barbarossa anyways. This alternate Russia, due to all the weaknesses discussed so far, would not last as well as the Soviets did, as St. Petersburg and Moscow likely fall in the first year of invasion, while an occupation of the Caucasus would undoubtedly follow. In extreme but not impossible scenarios, Turkey might even try joining the war against the Russians in a similar way to Finland in our timeline, to satisfy Turkish claims on Armenia. The full collapse of the Russian state before 1943 is a very serious option, as even in the best case scenarios, it would struggle to maintain itself, barely clinging on to life due to Lend-Lease, and that's about it. With America and Britain still in the war, eventually distracting the Germans by opening fronts elsewhere, or in the worst case scenarios, unleashing the sun on Germany, there could still be an eventual, very hard-fought Western victory, taking the lives of many, many more people across the world, seeing several German cities irrevocably destroyed, while Russia, if they didn't just collapse, which feels unlikely, sees most of their territory completely destroyed by this conflict. Perhaps best case, Russia doesn't fully collapse, holding on to whatever they could and resisting to the best of their ability. Now, the post-war map would look completely different to our own. The Russian state might regain territories conquered before the war and maybe be awarded minor gains, but that would be about it. Under no circumstance would Russia have the strength to seize half of Europe in the aftermath of the conflict. The entire continent, therefore, would mostly be redrawn by the Western powers, changing not only the borders of the continent, but also initially making every post-war state democratic. The German problem, in our timeline accidentally solved by the Cold War splitting it in half, would now need a different solution, ranging from minor weakenings of the state, multiple state solutions, or even further partitions of the nation. Now, despite Russia initially being weaker, not all is bad. Without the Cold War, this would be the time where a democratic, capitalist Russia can finally start to thrive. Russian-Western relations could peak after this conflict, and Russia would profit from things like the Marshall Program to rebuild their economy, as would the rest of Eastern Europe. The long-term advantages of democracy and capitalism, rather than Soviet state-planned economy, can start working to turn Russia, with its massive population, into a competitive and wealthy region. Somewhere in the 1960s or 70s, it might even eclipse the Soviet Union in terms of industry and economy. But of course, all of this relies on the Russians not collapsing during the war, which again, I very much expect that they will. If they do collapse though, the odds of a German victory have shot up significantly. But even if the Americans manage to eventually ensure a victory, the casualty rates of this war are horrifying. In the post-war world, Russia would be a shell of its former self, possibly completely partitioned by a victorious West, trying to create a new world order. That is, assuming they even can, and anarchy hasn't taken hold of the destroyed region. Either way, Europe is irreversibly changed in whatever way the war alternately concludes. To wrap up this way too long video, I am not a fan of the Bolsheviks. Not under Lenin, but especially not under Stalin. I also believe that, in isolation, a democratic and capitalist Russia would have created a better state and a healthier long-term economy than the Soviets did. But sadly, I do believe that in the historical context that the Russian democratic experiment was conducted, if the White Army even starts a democracy, we have to consider how they would fare against the problems of the time, like the Great Depression and a rising Germany and Japan. And here, I simply have to conclude that it is unlikely to me that 10 years of untested democracy would be enough to brace the Russians for the problems of the era. Don't get me wrong, the way the Bolsheviks combated the issues, by the intentional sacrifice of millions of lives, was a horrible event. Very much so not fueled by good intentions, but the personal ambitions of a select few. But this doesn't remove the fact that this horrific but effective industrial buildup greatly assisted the Soviets when it came to combating the Germans during World War II. Like mentioned, while not commanding the empire that the Soviets did, I do honestly believe that Russia would develop far, far better post-war. But the likelihood that a democratic Russia successfully survives until the end of an alternate World War II that is remotely similar to that of our timeline is difficult to imagine. Now, as a final point, I haven't focused too much on the Bolshevik effect on ideology. The Soviets were the first state to implement a version of communism in practice, and they were therefore very influential in the spread of it. More importantly, they specifically developed Stalinism, a staunchly autocratic, top-down version of communism, ruining many of the positive aspects the ideology was in theory founded upon. Beyond that, we can expect China to remain under the control of the nationalists, while communist movements worldwide would initially be weakened. On the other hand, without the Soviets so effectively destroying the public image of communism during the Cold War, we could see more influential socialist movements in nations like Italy and France, where socialism coexists within their democratic system, without causing panic that it might cause a shift towards an ideological rival. It is quite possible that the post-war world could be a lot more peaceful. Of course, not all issues are resolved, but the fundamental us versus them in terms of ideology could be replaced with a far smaller, more local competition for economic and political power. But for now, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.